the Ark Royal and one of the Swordfish torpedo bombers that is taking off in bad weather to intercept Bismarck. This contact was taken over by two Swordfish from Ark Royal. This carrier now launched an airstrike, but our aircrew were unaware of Sheffield's proximity to Bismarck, mistook the British cruiser for the German battleship, and therefore immediately attacked her. Their torpedoes had been fitted with influence detonators, and several of them exploded prematurely. Others missed their target, and the attacking aircraft then received a warning from Ark Royal that Sheffield was in the vicinity. Whereupon the Swordfish finally recognized the cruiser and broke off the attack. Ark Royal now launched and almost impossibly bad weather conditions for air operations, and from a distance of less than 40 miles upwind of Bismarck, a second strike consisting of 15 Swordfish. These were carrying torpedoes equipped with the standard and reliable contact detonators, which means it would hit the hull and then detonate. The influence detonators, or the magnetic detonators, is what the Germans would use, would detonate sometimes when they would get within the proximity of a ship's hull and then explode, and the pressure underneath would explode, push into the enemy ship's hull, and these, like the Germans, they had a lot of problems with them prematurely. They prematurely detonated, and this is what happened, luckily, for Sheffield. Um, the attack resulted in 2 or 3 hits on the German ship, one of which inflicted critical damage on her steering. A jammed rudder now meant she could now only sail away from her intended destination of Brest. At midnight, Lugins signaled his headquarters, "Ship unmaneuverable. We shall fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." At dusk that evening, and in atrocious weather conditions, Swordfish from Ark Royal launched the attack, of course, and so So with the torpedoes in which they had on the planes with contact detonators, they went after the Bismarck despite the lateness of the day. It was decided to try again. The attack went in almost darkness at around 2100 hours, but once again the Swordfish torpedo bombers found Bismarck with their ASV-2 radars. A hit by a single torpedo from a Swordfish flown by John Moffat jammed Bismarck's rudder and steering gear at 15 degrees to port, the resulting in her being initially able to only steam in a large circle. Repair efforts by the crew to free the rudder failed. Bismarck attempted to steer by alternating the power of her 3 propeller shafts, which, in the prevailing force 8 wind and sea state, resulted in the ship being forced to sail towards the King George V and Rodney battleships, the 2 British battleships that had been pursuing Bismarck from the west. At 23:40 hours on 26th of May, Admiral Lutyens delivered to Group West, the German command base, the signal, "Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." As I explained, throughout that night Bismarck was the target of intermittent torpedo attacks by the tribal-class destroyers HMS Cossack, Sikh, Maori, and Zulu, and the Polish destroyer ORP Purin. Sorry. Neither side scored a hit, but the constant worrying tactics of the British helped wear down the morale of the Germans and deepened the fatigue of an already exhausted crew. And here's another painting. Sinking of KMS Bismarck. The morning of Tuesday, May 27th, 1941, brought a heavy gray sky, a rising sea, and a tearing wind from the northwest. Because of this northwesterly gale, Admiral Tovey concluded an attack on Bismarck from windward was undesirable. He decided to approach on a northwesterly bearing, provided the enemy continued to steering northward. He would deploy to the south on an opposite course at a range of approximately 15,000 yards. Bismarck was sighted bearing 118 at a distance of 25,000 yards. Rodney and King George V drew closer to Bismarck and line abreast, their enemy well illuminated by the morning sun in the background. Rodney steering to the east so that her gunfire would work the length of Bismarck, while King George V took the side. They opened fire at 0847. The final phase consisted of four main phases. The first phase on the 26th consisted of airstrikes by torpedo bombers from the British aircraft carrier Ark Royal, of course the steering gear, and other damage to the rudder. Second phase was the harassment, 26th, 27th of May, with no serious damage. Third phase, the morning of 27th, was an attack by the British battleships King George V and Rodney, supported by cruisers. After about 100 minutes of fighting, Bismarck was sunk, combined with effects of shell fire, torpedo hits, and deliberate scuttling. On the British side, Rodney was lightly damaged by near misses and by the blast effects of her own guns. British warships rescued 111 survivors from the Bismarck before being obliged to withdraw because of an apparent U-boat sighting, leaving several hundred men to their fate. The following morning, a U-boat and a German weather ship rescued 5 more survivors. In the final phase, withdrawing British ships were attacked the next day, on 20th of May, by aircraft of the Luftwaffe, resulting in the loss of the destroyer HMS Meshana. In this here, you can see movie from the movie Sink the Bismarck. This is one of the famous movies in the 60s, the sinking of the Bismarck. Only 111 men rescued. So Bismarck returned fire, but her inability to steer and her list to port severely affected her shooting accuracy. Her low speed of 11 knots at 20 kilometers an hour made her an easy target, and she was soon hit several times by the large guns of the British warships. With the heavy cruisers HMS Norfolk and Dorsetshire adding their firepower later, after the Bismarck's heavy guns had all been put out of action. One 16-inch 406.4mm salvo from Rodney destroyed the forward control post, killing most of the senior officers, while other salvos destroyed all 4 main gun turrets. Within 30 minutes, Bismarck's guns had all been silenced, and the ship was ever lower, even lower in the water. Rodney now closed to point-blank range, approximately 3 kilometers, to fire into the superstructure, while King George V fired from further out, so her fire would strike the Bismarck from a more vertical angle and be more likely to penetrate the decks. And that's the Rodney in the top picture there. Bismarck continued to fly her ensign, but with no sign of surrender despite the unequal struggle. The British were loath to lead the Bismarck. Their fuel and shell supplies were low, a demonstration of how difficult it was for a battleship to sink a similar unit in a balanced engagement. However, when it became obvious that their enemy could not reach port, Rodney, King George V, and the destroyers were sent home. Norfolk had used its last torpedoes, therefore Dorsetshire launched 4 torpedoes which may have hit Bismarck at comparatively short range. Although the battleship's upper works were almost completely destroyed, her engines were still functioning and the hull appeared to be relatively sound. Therefore, rather than risk her being captured, First Officer Hans Eels ordered the men below deck to abandon ship. He instructed the engine room crews to open the ship's watertight doors and prepare scuttling charges. Gurhan Junak, the chief engineering officer, primed the charges and ordered the crew to abandon the ship. Junak and his comrades heard the demolition charges detonate as they made their way up through the various levels. Most of the crew went into the water, but few sailors from the lower engine spaces got out alive. Bismarck went under the waves at 10:39 that morning. Oh, 10:39. It's another famous painting of her being sunk. So Dorsetshire and Maori attempted to rescue survivors, but a U-boat alarm caused them to leave the scene after having rescued about 110, 111 Bismarck survivors, abandoning the majority of Bismarck's 2,200-man crew to the mercy of the water. The next morning, U-74 dispatched to try to rescue Bismarck's logbook, and which heard um, sinking noises from a distance. And the German weather ship Schustenwald picked up 2 survivors. After the sinking, Admiral John Tovey said the Bismarck had put up a most gallant fight against impossible odds, worthy of the old days of the Imperial German Navy, and she went down with her flags flying, her colors flying. Sub-Lieutenant Eric Sobotko from Poland, serving in HMS Rodney, was pleased with the destruction of the German vessel, and mused, "Justice, you still exist." Nevertheless, the board of the Admiralty issued a message of thanks to those involved. Their lordships congratulate CNC Home Fleet and all concerned in the unrelenting pursuit and successful destruction of the enemy's most powerful warship. The loss of the Admiral-class battlecruiser HMS Hood and her company, which is so deeply regretted, has thus been avenged and the Atlantic made more secure for our trade and that of our allies. From the information at present available to their lordships, there can be no doubt that had it not been for the gallantry, skill, and devotion to duty of the Fleet Air Arm in both Victorious and in Ark Royal, our object might not have been achieved. Unaware of the fate of the ship, Group West, the German command base, continued to issue signals to Bismarck for some hours, until Reuters reported news from Britain that the ship had been sunk. In Britain, the House of Commons was informed of the sinking early that afternoon. After the battle, the British warships returned to the United Kingdom with 111 Bismarck survivors. One died later of his wounds. After a period of interrogation and processing, the survivors spent the rest of the war as prisoners. No British ship was sunk during this action, but the destroyer HMS Mashona was sunk by the Luftwaffe during the subsequent withdrawal the following day, as I did mention that. In February 1942, Schornhaus, Gneisenau, and Prince Eugen moved from Brest back to Germany in the Channel Dash. That's the Channel Dash. While this was an embarrassment for the British, it was the end of the German surface threat in the Atlantic. The loss of Bismarck, our convoys, and the perceived invasion threat to Norway had persuaded Hitler to withdraw. The war had come too early for the German naval expansion project Plan Zebra. Battleships powerful enough to destroy any convoy escort with escorts able to annihilate the convoy were never achieved. Although the number of ships the raiders sank was relatively small compared to with the losses of U-boats, mines, and aircraft. Their raid severely disrupted the Allied convoy system, reducing British imports, and strained the home fleet. With the disastrous convoy battles of October 1940, which forced a change in British tactics, the most important of these was the introduction of permanent escort groups to improve the coordination and effectiveness of the ships and men in battle. The British escorts were helped by a gradual increase in the number of escort vessels available as the old ex-American destroyers and the new British and Canadian-built Flower-class corvettes were now coming into service in numbers. Many of these ships became part of the huge expansion of the Royal Canadian Navy, which grew from a handful of destroyers at the outbreak of the war to take on an increased share of convoy escort duty. Others of the new ships were manned by free French, Norwegian, and Dutch crews, but these were a tiny minority of the total number and directly under British command. By 1941, American public opinion had begun to swing against Germany, but the war was still essentially Great Britain and the Empire against Germany. Initially, the new escort groups consisted of 2 or 3 destroyers and a half dozen corvettes. Since the 2 or 3 of the groups would usually be in dock repairing weather or battle damage, the groups typically sailed with about 6 ships. The training of the escorts also improved as the realities of the battle became obvious. A new base was set up at Tobermory in the Hebrides, to prepare the new escort ships and their crews for the demands of battle under the strict regime of Vice Admiral Gilbert O. Stevenson. In February of 1941, the Admiralty moved the headquarters of Western Approaches Command from Plymouth to Liverpool, where much closer contact with and control of the Atlantic convoys was possible. Greater cooperation with supporting aircraft was also achieved. In April, the Admiralty took over operational control of Coastal Command aircraft. At a tactical level, new shortwave radar sets that could detect surface U-boats were suitable for both small ships and aircraft began to arrive during the spring and continuing on through in February, early 1941. The impact of these changes first began to be felt in the battles during the spring of 1941 and early March. Prine and U-47 failed to return from patrol. 2 weeks later, in the Battle of Convoy HX-112, the newly formed 3rd Escort Group of 5 destroyers and 2 corvettes held off the U-boat pack. U-100 was detected by the primitive radar on the destroyer HMS Vanek, rammed and sunk. Shortly afterwards, U-99 was also caught and sunk. Its crew captured. Dönitz had lost his 3 leading aces, Kretschmer, Prine, and Shepk. Dönitz now moved his wolf packs further west in order to catch the convoys before the anti-submarine escort joined. This new strategy was rewarded at the beginning of April when the pack found convoy SC-26 before its anti-submarine escort had joined. 10 ships were sunk, but another U-boat was lost. Adopting to more responsibility in June and December 1941, the British decided to provide convoy escort for the full length of the North Atlantic crossing. To this end, the Admiralty asked the Royal Canadian Navy on the 23rd of May 1941 to assume the responsibility for protecting convoys in the Western Zone and to establish the base for its escort force at St. John's, Newfoundland. On June 13, 1941, Commodore Leonard Murray, Royal Canadian Navy, assumed his post as Commodore commanding Newfoundland Escort Force, under the overall authority of the Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches in Liverpool. 6 Canadian destroyers and 17 corvettes reinforced by 7 destroyers, 3 sloops, and 5 corvettes of the Royal Navy were assembled for duty in the force, which escorted the convoys from Canadian ports to Newfoundland and then on to a meeting point south of Iceland, where the British escort groups took over. Here's HMCS Bradford, HMCS Snowbury. These are the Flower class corvettes. The Flower class vessels were slow for a warship, with maximum speed of 16 knots, 30 kilometers an hour. They were also lightly armed, as they were intended solely for anti-submarine warfare. Many of the Royal Canadian Navy's original Flower class ships were initially fitted with minesweeping equipment, while virtually all of the modified flowers were fitted with a limited anti-aircraft capacity. The original flowers had the standard Royal Navy layout, consisting of a raised forecastle, a well deck, then the bridge or wheelhouse, and a continuous deck running aft. The crew quarters were in the forecastle, while the galley was at the rear, making for poor messing arrangements. The original Flower class was fitted with a 4-inch 102mm gun on the bow, depth charge racks carrying 40 charges on the stern, a minesweeping winch, a 2-pounder 40mm pom-pom gun on a bandstand over the engine room. Due to initial shortages, a pair of Lewis guns was sometimes substituted for the pom-pom, which would have left the ship very vulnerable to aircraft attack in its envisaged role as coastal convoy escort and patrol in the North Sea. The long-range endurance of the vessels, coupled with early wartime shortages of larger escort warships, saw the Flowers assigned to transatlantic convoy escort, where Luftwaffe fighter bombers were rarely encountered. Vessels assigned to the Mediterranean Sea usually had their anti-aircraft capacity significantly upgraded. Underwater detection capability was provided by a fixed Aztec dome. This was later modified to be retractable. Subsequent inventions, such as the high-frequency radio detector finder (HFDUF), were added later on in various radar systems, such as the Type 271, which proved particularly effective in low visibility conditions in the North Atlantic. What you're seeing here, okay, is the Hedgehog, which will be something I talk about later on, which is an anti-submarine depth bomb. Here we have one dropping depth charges on an enemy submarine. By 1941, the United States was taking an increasingly part in the war. Despite its normal neutrality, in April 1941, President Roosevelt extended the Pan-American Security Zone east almost as far as Iceland. British forces occupied Iceland when Denmark fell to the Germans in 1940. The U.S. was persuaded to provide forces to relieve British troops on the island. American warships began escorting Allied convoys in the Western Atlantic as far as Iceland, and had several hostile encounters with the U-boats. On mid-ocean escort force of British and Canadian and American destroyers and corvettes was organized following the declaration of war by the United States. In June 1941, the U.S. realized the tropical Atlantic had become dangerous for unescorted American as well as British warships, or British ships in general. On May 21st, the SS Robin Moore, an American vessel carrying no military supplies at all, was stopped by U-69 about 1,210 kilometers west of Freetown, Sierra Leone. After its passengers and crew were allowed 30 minutes to board lifeboats, U-69 torpedoed, shelled, and sank the ship. The survivors then drifted without rescue or detection for up to 18 days. When news of the sinking reached the U.S., few shipping companies felt truly safe anywhere. As Time magazine noted in June 1941, if such sinkings continue, U.S. ships bound for other places remote from fighting fronts will be in danger. Henceforth, the U.S. would either have to recall its ships from the ocean or enforce its right to the free use of the seas. So here is, of course, what we call the security zone, North America, of course, the American security zone, and of course, this Pan-American security zone here comes down through and up, down. Of course, this is the proposed new route, right? And it's extending almost all the way up through by Iceland. And America is going to put more effort into securing its shipping routes. And that's all the way from through down to Sierra Leone, down the Horn of Africa, all the way to Great Britain itself and beyond. So here we have German U-boat losses for each year of the war. 39, 40, 41, you can see they're going up. This is the year I'm talking about. 42, we're going to see a jump. 43 and 44, a massive jump near the ending of the war. And then, of course, 45. Allied merchant shipping losses for each year of the war. So, 1939, a small bit, and that's up to 250,000 tons. This is 2 million tons in 1940. That's in millions of tons, yep. Nearly the same amount in 1941, but in 1942 we're going to have a massive increase up to over 6.5 million tons sunk in the next year we talk about, which is 1942 in the Battle of the Atlantic. A couple number presentations down the road. Here's Sierra Leone, Liberia, Gold Coast, and 42, which we'll talk about. This route here, Britain starts providing escorts in June 1941 for full length of North Atlantic convoys crossing. The Royal Canadian Navy assumes responsibility for the western zone from bases in St. John's, Newfoundland, and that's right here. That's right there. So we'll talk more about, of course, May and March 41 is HX-112 attacked by 5 U-boats. 5 ships, 50,000 tons lost, but U-boats. 2 of Germany's leading aces, Schepke and Otto Kretschmer, sunk in this area here. And of course, June 1940 were the new U-boat bases. Here's Lorient, Saint Nazaire, Saint Rochelle, and Brest. There's 4 of them here. And of course, these are the major areas that I'm talking about here, and here. And then, of course, this is the black zone. And this here is where we'll talk about later on in the war. Down here, you have, of course, this is the connection to the U.S. and the Canadian coast here. And the route for U.S. down in the Pan American zone. British Guinea, British Guinea, French Guinea, Guyana, Miami, and then of course New York, Halifax, Sydney, Nova Scotia, and St. John's, Newfoundland are critical spots for the Battle of the Atlantic, for Atlantic convoys. And this here will become, which we'll talk to later on, in the route to USSR, which we'll talk about after we talk about the invasion, beginning with Operation Barbarossa against the USSR. Principal theaters of the Royal Canadian Navy in operations 1939 and 1945. Through here, escorts through from New York, Boston, Casco Bay, of course, then St. John, Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, Halifax, of course, Sydney, Nova Scotia, St. John's, Newfoundland, Torbay. Here, these are routes. Canadian coastal zone becomes Canadian North-West Atlantic, effective, of course, April 30th, 1943. So that's something we'll come out. I will talk about later on. And these are the main routes here. The main convoy routes are here and here, and through. And these are where a lot of the major U-boats have been sunk. This division between U.S. and British strategic zones as of revised July 1942. Here's Belfast, Liverpool, Portsmouth, Plymouth, London, and okay. At the same time, the British were working on a number of technical developments which would address the German submarine superiority. Though these were British inventions, the critical technologies were provided freely to the U.S., which then renamed the manufacturing and manufactured them. In many cases, this has resulted in the misconception these were American developments. Likewise, the U.S. provided the British with technology, like Catalina flying boats and Liberator bombers, B-24 Liberators, and PBY Catalina flying boats, patrol boats. That, of course, these were major important contributions to the war effort. Aircraft ranges were constantly improving, but the Atlantic was far too large to be covered completely by land-based types. A stopgap measure was instituted by fitting ramps to the front of some of the cargo ships known as catapult aircraft merchantmen, CAM ships, equipped with a lone expendable Hurricane fighter aircraft. When a German bomber approached, the fighter was fired off at the end of the ramp with a large rocket to shoot down or drive off the German aircraft. The pilot then ditched in the water and hopefully being picked up by one of the escort ships. If land was too far away, 9 combat launches were made, resulting in the destruction of 8 Axis aircraft for the loss of 1 Allied pilot. Here are the CAM ships here and the Hurricane fighters. So Haftaf, high frequency direction finding. One of the more important developments was shipborne direction finding radar or radio equipment known as HFDF, high frequency direction finding, or Haftaf, which was gradually fitted to the larger escorts. HFDF let an operator determine the direction of a radio signal, regardless of whether the content could be read. Since the Wolfpack relied on U-boats reporting convoy positions by radio, there was a steady stream of messages to intercept. A destroyer could then run in the direction of the signal and attack the U-boat, or at least force it to submerge, causing it to lose contact, which might prevent an attack on the convoy. When 2 ships fitted with HFDF Haftaf accompanied a convoy, a fix on the transmitter's position, not just direction, could be determined. The British also made extensive use of shore Haftaf stations to keep convoys updated with positions of U-boats. And here's some of the pictures of the Haftaf direction finders. The radio technology behind Haftaf was simple and well understood by both sides, but the technology commonly used before the war used a manually rotated aerial to fix the direction of the transmitter. This was delicate work, took quite a time to accomplish to any degree of accuracy, and since it only revealed the line along which the transmission originated, a single set could not determine if the transmission was from the true direction or its reciprocal 180 degrees in the opposite direction. The 2 sets were required to fix the position. Believing this to still be the case, German U-boat radio operators considered themselves fairly safe if they kept messages short. The British, however, developed an oscilloscope-based indicator which instantly fixed the position the moment a radio operator touched his Morse key. It worked simply with a crossed pair of conventional and fixed directional aerials. The oscilloscope display showing the relative received strength from each aerial as an elongated ellipse showing the line relative to the ship. So they receive strength from each aerial as an elongated ellipse showing the line relative to the ship. The innovation was a sense aerial which when switched in suppressed the ellipse in the wrong direction, leaving only the correct bearing. With this, there was hardly any need to triangulate. The Escort could just run down the precise bearing provided and use radar to for the final positioning. Many U-boat attacks were suppressed and submarines sunk in this way. A good example of the great difference minor aspects of technology could make to the battle. And this is one of the ships. This is the Huff Duff on top of one of the British warships. British or U.S., I'm not sure. Enigma, the way Daniels conducted the U-boat campaign required relatively large volumes of traffic between U-boats and headquarters. This was thought to be safe as the radio messages were enciphered using the Enigma cipher machine, which the Germans considered unbreakable. In addition, the Kriegsmarine used much more secure operating procedures than the Heer Army or Luftwaffe Air Force. The machine's 3 rotors were chosen from a set of 8 rather than the other services 5 rather. Sorry, the rotors and their settings were changed every other day using a system of key sheets and bigram tables that were issued to operators. In 1939, it was generally believed that at the British Government Code and Cipher School, GC and CS at Bletchley Park, that naval enigma could not be broken. Only the head of the German naval section, Frank Birch, and the mathematician Alan Turing believed otherwise. And here is the famous Enigma machine. Been in many movies, and they actually just found another one. I believe it was on the floor of where one of the U-boats had been sunk. I forget exactly where it was. The British codebreakers needed to know the wiring of the special naval Enigma rotors, and the destruction of U-boat U-33 by HMS Gleaner in February 1940 provided this information. In early 1941, the Royal Navy made a concerted effort to assist the codebreakers. And on May 9th, crew members of the destroyer Bulldog boarded U-110 and recovered her cryptologic material, including bigram tables and current Enigma keys. The captured material allowed all U-boat traffic to be read for several weeks until the keys ran out. The familiarity of codebreakers gained that the codebreakers gained with the usual content of messages helped in breaking new keys. So here are the rotors, the yellow lamp board. Here's the keyboard and the plug board. Those plug into for radio receivers. The Enigma machine was invented by a German engineer, Arthur Schibius, shortly after World War I. The machine, of which a number of varying types were produced, resembled a typewriter. It had a lamp board above the keys with a lamp for each letter. The operator pressed the key for the plain text letter of the message, and the enciphered letter lit up on the lamp board. It was adopted by the German Armed Forces between 1926 and 1935. Here you can see Bletchley Park, and this is where Alan Turing came up with the decoding, the Enigma. It broke the Enigma code, the decoding machine. And this is where it all happened in the Second World War. The machine contained a series of interchangeable rotors which rotated every time a key was pressed to keep the cipher changing continuously. This was combined with a plug board on the front of the machine where a pair of letters were transposed. Each of these two systems combined with offered 103 sextillion possible settings to choose from, which the Germans believed made Enigma unbreakable. The Poles had broken Enigma in as early 1932, but in 1939, with the prospect of war, the Poles decided to inform the British of their successes. Knox, one of the former British World War I codebreakers, was convinced he could break the system and set up an Enigma research section, comprising himself and Tony Kendrick, later joined by Peter Twin, Alan Turing, and Gordon Welshman. They worked in the stable yard at Bletchley Park, and that is where the first wartime Enigma messages were broken by the British in January 1940. Enigma traffic continued to be broken routinely at Bletchley Park for the remainder of the war. And this is right here is the is a modern day picture of Bletchley Park, what it looked like. And so here we have this is the decoding machine. This is the same one that Alan Turing made. I'm not exactly sure. It might be. I have to take a look. So, throughout the summer and autumn of 1941, Enigma intercepts combined with Hoff-Duff enabled the British to plot the positions of U-boat patrol lines and route convoys around them. Merchant ship losses dropped by over two-thirds in July 1941, and the losses remained low until November. This Allied advantage was offset by the growing number of U-boats coming into service. The Type 7C began reaching the Atlantic in large numbers in 1941. By the end of 1945, 568 had been commissioned. Although the Allies could protect their convoys in late 1941, they were not sinking many U-boats. The Flower-class corvette Escorts could detect and defend, but they were not fast enough to attack effectively. Here is one of the U-boats, the Type 7, with the 533 millimeter torpedo tubes in the bow. You can fire T1 and T2 torpedoes, which T2s were had just a standard speed of 30 knots, but they had a much extended range and they were more reliable. Again, they could be fitted with a proximity fuse, magnetic detonator, or an impact detonator. Um, Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's Aaron Bowman. Serving as military specialist for Carleton County, I'm going to end this presentation, and then I'm going to do another one, a separate one on the U-boats in the Mediterranean. Thank you very much.